December 12, 1942. Crystal City, Texas. Margarete Schmidt stood at the entrance of a one-room shelter, measuring 12 feet by 16 feet, her hands trembling as she clutched a brown paper bag containing her family's first American rations. Inside that bag was more food than she had seen in a single delivery in months. 2 loaves of white bread, a full pound of butter, fresh meat wrapped in butcher paper, real coffee beans. Her 5-year-old daughter, Erica, reached up and touched the bread with wonder, as if it might disappear if handled too roughly. Margarete had not chosen to come to this place, 110 miles south of San Antonio, where barbed wire fences stretched 10 feet high and guard towers punctuated the perimeter every 60 feet. She had arrived with the first group of 35 German internees and their families, brought here under the authority of the Immigration and Naturalization Service as part of America's Enemy Alien Control Program. Her husband, a machinist from Cincinnati who had maintained membership in a German-American social club, had been arrested by the FBI days after Pearl Harbor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. She had volunteered to join him in detention rather than remain separated, bringing their children into captivity with her. But now, standing in the Texas dust with that bag of groceries in her hands, Margarete felt something break inside her chest. Not the sharp crack of sudden trauma, but the slow, grinding collapse of a wall she had been building for years. She sat down on the wooden step of her shelter, set the bag beside her, and began to weep, not quietly, not with restraint, but with the full-throated sobs of someone who had finally been given permission to acknowledge how hungry she had been, how afraid, how utterly worn down by the arithmetic of survival. A question that haunts historians who study the Crystal City family internment camp and the broader experience of German women during World War II is not whether these tears were shed. The documentary evidence and oral histories confirm that they were. The question is what those tears meant. Were they relieved in abundance after scarcity? Shame at accepting food from those designated as enemies? Grief for loved ones still starving in Germany? Or something more complex? A recognition that the simple act of being fed well fundamentally altered one's relationship to ideology, nationality, and identity itself. To understand the weight of that paper bag in Margarete's hands, we must first understand what German women had endured before arriving in American custody. The story begins not in 1942, but years earlier, with the systematic transformation of Germany into a war economy built on the calculated starvation of others. When Adolf Hitler assumed power in January 1933, Germany faced a fundamental problem that had haunted the nation since the 19th century. The country could not feed itself. Despite agricultural improvements under Otto von Bismarck's protectionist policies, Germany remained dependent on food imports to sustain its growing population. This vulnerability had proven catastrophic during World War I, when the Allied blockade caused widespread malnutrition and contributed to the deaths of an estimated 763,000 German civilians from starvation and related diseases. Hitler and his agricultural planners, particularly Reich Minister of Food and Agriculture Richard Walther Darré, were determined that such suffering would not recur among ethnic Germans. Their solution was not to limit military ambitions or population growth, but to seize the agricultural resources of other nations and deliberately starve their populations. By 1939, Germany had achieved 83% self-sufficiency in basic crops through aggressive agricultural policies. But this was not enough to feed both a civilian population and a military machine engaged in total war across multiple fronts. The answer came in the form of what historians now call the Hunger Plan, developed primarily by Herbert Backe, State Secretary in the Ministry of Food and Agriculture. The plan, finalized in May 1941 before the invasion of the Soviet Union, was genocidal in intent. It called for the systematic starvation of tens of millions of Soviet citizens through the confiscation of grain supplies, particularly from Ukraine, which Nazi planners viewed as Europe's breadbasket. The food would be redirected to feed the German military and civilian population. Those deemed racially or economically superfluous, especially urban populations and Jews, would simply be left to starve. As a German economic planning document from May 1941 stated with chilling clarity, many tens of millions of people in occupied Soviet territories would become superfluous and would die or must emigrate. The document continued that attempts to rescue the population from death through starvation by obtaining surpluses from agricultural zones could only be at the expense of provisioning Europe, preventing the possibility of Germany holding out until the end of the war. The hunger plan was implemented with brutal efficiency, though never to its full intended scale. In occupied Poland, the German minority received 2,613 calories per day by mid-1941, while ethnic Poles received 699 calories, and Jews in the ghettos received 184 calories. The Jewish ration provided a mere 7.5% of human daily nutritional needs. In Warsaw alone, inadequate food rations contributed to tens of thousands of deaths. Across occupied Soviet territories, an estimated 4.2 million Soviet citizens died from starvation and related causes between 1941 and 1944 as German forces seized grain supplies and left local populations to perish. This system of organized starvation extended across occupied Europe. In the Netherlands, a German-imposed embargo on food transport during the winter of 1944–45 resulted in the Dutch hunger winter, which killed approximately 22,000 people. In Greece, German confiscation policies led to a famine that killed an estimated 500,000 people, making it the worst famine in Western and Southern Europe during the war. The bread and meat that German women ate during the early war years came quite literally at the cost of mass death elsewhere. But German women were not making these policy decisions, nor were they privy to the full details of the hunger plan's implementation. What they experienced was the gradual tightening of rationing on the home front as the war progressed, and the systematic manipulation of information about where their food actually came from. Germany had instituted comprehensive food rationing almost immediately upon the declaration of war in September 1939, having learned from World War I that civilian morale depended heavily on adequate nutrition. The initial ration system was graduated by occupation, with those engaged in heavy labor receiving significantly more than sedentary workers. At the outbreak of war, average German civilians using only their ration cards could expect approximately 2,700 calories per day. Pregnant women and heavy laborers received substantially more, with those in the highest ration bracket, less than 2% of the population, receiving 4,650 calories daily. These official rations remained relatively stable through the early years of the war, maintained through the ruthless exploitation of occupied territories. By 1941–42, when much of Europe was experiencing severe food shortages, German civilians still received adequate nutrition. Around 40% of the bread and meat consumed by German armed forces and civilians came from occupied territories or from the labor of workers forcibly deported to work on German farms. By autumn 1941, 1.1 million Poles and Ukrainians, half of them women, were working on German farms, alongside 1.2 million prisoners of war, mostly Russians and French. The forced labor of imported workers was responsible for about 20% of Germany's food production during the war. But the rations told only part of the story. Access to supplemental food through black markets, farm connections, and informal networks varied dramatically based on geography, class, and connections. Urban women, particularly those in major cities, faced far more difficulty obtaining adequate food than those in rural areas. Hildegard Schmidt, a housewife in Munich, kept a diary throughout the war years that provides intimate detail about the daily struggle to feed a family. Her entries from 1941 describe the careful arithmetic of survival, weighing bread portions on kitchen scales, saving vegetable peelings for soup stock, soaking dried beans overnight to maximize their volume, substituting chicory for coffee, making what were euphemistically called roof pigs, cats raised in rooftop cages for meat when other sources failed. For German women, the burden of managing household nutrition fell almost entirely on their shoulders. With men conscripted into military service, women became responsible not just for obtaining food, but for making inadequate rations stretch to feed children, elderly relatives, and themselves. This required constant calculation, substitution, and creativity. Real coffee disappeared first, replaced by roasted acorns and barley. Sugar became scarce. Fresh fruits were luxuries. Meat portions shrank and changed composition, with horse meat becoming common and the actual contents of tinned meat, labelled simply as canned meat, remaining deliberately ambiguous. The emotional toll of this responsibility was immense. Women stood in queues for hours to obtain rations. They cultivated small gardens wherever space permitted. They preserved and pickled every scrap of food possible. And always, they made decisions about who in the family would receive what portions. In the winter of 1941–42, as Germany's eastern offensive stalled and Soviet resistance intensified, these calculations began to carry life or death weight. Then, starting in autumn 1944, the entire system began to collapse. As Allied forces advanced from the west and Soviet forces from the east, Germany lost access to the occupied territories that had been feeding its population. The official bread ration was cut from 12,450 grams per month in May 1944 to 9,700 grams in August. By December, it had fallen to 8,900 grams. In April 1945, it plummeted catastrophically to 3,600 grams. The meat ration fell from 1,900 grams to 550 grams over the same period. Nobody could survive on these official rations alone. A vast black market emerged, often controlled by escaped foreign workers who had themselves been starving under German occupation. Armed confrontations between black market gangs and the Gestapo became regular occurrences in German cities. Diseases associated with malnutrition, tuberculosis, rickets, pellagra, surged in German cities during 1944 and early 1945. The carefully managed rationing system that German women had struggled to navigate for years simply broke apart. Elsa Müller, a baker's wife from Dresden, wrote in February 1945 about watching her elderly mother-in-law slowly waste, away from hunger. "She tells us she is full after half a slice of bread," Elsa recorded. "But I see how her hands shake when she sets down the spoon. She is giving us her portions. I try to give them back, but she refuses. She says the children need more than an old woman. I do not know how to make her understand that without her, I cannot carry on." This was the context in which a small number of German women, primarily German nationals living in the United States or German Americans, married to men suspected of Nazi sympathies, found themselves detained and sent to places like Crystal City, Texas. Their journey to American detention often began with the arrest of male family members in the days and weeks following Pearl Harbor. The FBI had been compiling custodial detention lists since 1939, identifying individuals of German, Japanese, and Italian descent who might pose security threats in the event of war. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, these lists became arrest warrants. Within 48 hours, thousands of men were in custody. Many were community leaders, teachers, newspaper editors, or simply members of German-American cultural organizations. The evidence required for detention was often thin. Subscribing to a German-language newspaper or maintaining membership in a social club could be sufficient grounds for arrest. The wives of these detained men faced an impossible choice. They could remain free but separated from their husbands for an indefinite period, struggling to support families alone in communities now suspicious of anyone with German connections. Or they could voluntarily join their husbands in detention, bringing their children with them into captivity. For many women, particularly those with young children or limited English, joining their husbands seemed the lesser evil. Camp administrators euphemistically described these women and children as voluntary internees, though the choice was hardly voluntary when the alternative was destitution and social isolation. The Crystal City Family Internment Camp, administered by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, was specifically designed to accommodate these families. Built on land leased from the Farm Security Administration, which had previously operated the site as a migrant labor camp, Crystal City eventually housed as many as 4,000 internees from German, Japanese, and Italian backgrounds. Many German families were German nationals who had been living in Latin American countries before being deported to the United States as part of a hemispheric security program. Others were German Americans arrested within the United States itself. The first German internees arrived on December 12, 1942. By August 1944, the camp held 804 persons of German descent, alongside 2,104 persons of Japanese descent, with the two populations housed in separate sections of the compound. The camp's German section included a German bakery, mess hall, community hall, and individual cottages for families. A weekly German-language newsletter was published with the title Unter uns, meaning among us. For women like Margarete Schmidt, the initial arrival was disorienting. The camp was surrounded by 10-foot-high barbed wire fences with guard towers at every corner, illuminated by floodlights positioned every 60 feet. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter on horseback and on foot. All mail entering or leaving the camp was censored. Daily roll calls were mandatory. The compound covered 100 acres, with an additional 190 acres devoted to farming and recreation. This was unmistakably a prison, but it was also, in ways that created profound psychological discomfort, a place of relative abundance. Upon arrival, each family was assigned housing based on their size. Couples and those with small children received one room, shelters measuring 12 feet by 16 feet. Larger families were assigned apartments in multi-room buildings. Some families with special needs received small cottages that included indoor bathrooms, showers, kitchens, and hot water, amenities that exceeded what many had known as civilians in Germany. Most internees, however, used centrally located bathing and toilet facilities. Each family received an initial allocation of cooking utensils, dishes, chairs, iceboxes, furniture, bedding, curtains, and partitions. Worn-out items could be replaced by turning in the old ones. But it was the food distribution that created the most profound shock. According to international law, specifically the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war and civilian internees were entitled to rations equivalent to those of their captors' military forces. The United States took this obligation seriously, providing internees with the same basic rations as American garrison troops. This meant white bread made with refined flour and real wheat, fresh coffee with actual coffee beans, not acorn substitutes, butter and margarine in quantities sufficient for cooking and spreading, meat in recognizable cuts, beef and pork and chicken, fresh vegetables when available, real sugar for sweetening, milk for children, a full quart per child per day. Initially, food was delivered directly to each family, but by September 1943, the camp administration implemented a token system they called coupon checks, a form of camp currency that allowed internees to purchase food and essential items at two camp stores, the German General Store and the Japanese Union Store. The German store was stocked with items familiar to German palates, sausages and dark breads and pickles, alongside standard American groceries. Internees could also participate in paid work programs, earning 10 cents per hour for labor, including vegetable planting, tending orange orchards and beehives, raising pigs and chickens, washing laundry, repairing clothes and shoes, and manufacturing mattresses, furniture, and bakery items. The Japanese section of the camp received special foods including soy sauce, tofu, seaweed, dried shrimp, and large quantities of rice. The deliberate accommodation of cultural food preferences demonstrated a level of administrative attention to internee welfare that contradicted Nazi propaganda about American indifference and cruelty. Maria Berger, a German national who had been living in Chicago before her husband's arrest, wrote in a letter to her sister that camp censors intercepted. "The food here is strange to describe," she wrote. "There is so much of it, more than I knew how to cook at first. The children eat meat with every meal if they wish. There is butter for their bread, real butter, as much as they want. Yesterday, Heinz ate so much he vomited. His stomach is not accustomed to richness. I had to tell him to eat slowly, to not eat as if someone might take the plate away." This abundance created an ethical and emotional crisis for many German women in Crystal City. They knew, through letters from relatives that managed to pass through censors and through rumors shared within the camp, that Germany was experiencing increasing food shortages. They knew their mothers, sisters, cousins, and friends were hungry. Some had children or siblings still in Germany facing malnutrition, and here they sat, behind American barbed wire, eating better than they had before the war, better than they would have in Germany, better than millions across war-torn Europe. The psychological weight of this contradiction manifested in different ways. Some women responded with guilt that bordered on self-punishment. They ate minimal portions and tried to send money or food parcels to relatives, though camp regulations strictly limited such shipments. Others experienced a defensive anger, insisting that their detention was unjust and that good treatment did not excuse the fundamental violation of their imprisonment. Still others quietly accepted the abundance while compartmentalizing their feelings, focusing on providing for their children in the present moment while avoiding thoughts of the larger context. But for many women, there came a moment, often in private, when the full weight of their situation overwhelmed their ability to maintain emotional control. The tears came not from a single emotion but from the collision of many: relief at having enough food, shame at relief, grief for those still starving, confusion about what this treatment meant about American intentions and German propaganda, exhaustion from years of managing scarcity, and beneath it all, a disorienting recognition that perhaps the things they had been told about American cruelty and democratic weakness might not be entirely true. These moments often occurred around food itself: a child eating an apple without rationing anxiety, the smell of real coffee brewing, the sight of white bread that could be consumed without weighing and calculating, the texture of butter spread thick on bread. Small sensory experiences that represented not luxuries but the simple absence of deprivation triggered cascades of emotion that had been suppressed for years. Internee testimonies collected decades later by researchers document these responses with remarkable consistency. Ingrid Iserloh, who was 13 when her family was detained at Crystal City, recalled in an interview conducted years after the war. "My mother cried the day they gave us butter," she said. "Not a little bit of butter, a whole pound. She just stood in our kitchen area holding this block of butter and crying. I did not understand at first. When I was a child, I thought butter was good. Why would it make her cry? Only later did I understand. It was not sad crying and not happy crying. It was too much feeling to hold inside." The camp administration observed these responses but interpreted them through the lens of cultural adjustment rather than deeper psychological transformation. Joseph O'Rourke, the camp commander, wrote in his historical narrative of Crystal City that many internees, particularly women, experienced initial difficulty adapting to American food and abundance. He attributed this primarily to unfamiliarity with American cooking methods and ingredients, rather than to the trauma of scarcity suddenly replaced by plenty. But the transformation went deeper than O'Rourke recognized. Living in an environment where food was reliable, where children could eat until satisfied, where meals did not require exhausting calculation, gradually altered internees' fundamental relationship with abundance and scarcity. Women who had spent years making impossible choices about food distribution could suddenly make decisions based on preference rather than survival arithmetic. This shift, however gradual, undermined some of the core narratives about American society that German propaganda had emphasized. Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed American democracy as weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse. American abundance, when acknowledged at all, was framed as evidence of moral corruption and the exploitation of other nations. Americans were depicted as soft, undisciplined, and unable to make necessary sacrifices. The implication was clear: Germany's disciplined scarcity demonstrated moral superiority, while American excess revealed degeneracy. But the reality German women encountered in Crystal City complicated these narratives. Americans were treating enemy aliens and their families according to international law, providing food that exceeded many internees' pre-war standards. This was not evidence of weakness, but of systematic organization and genuine abundance. Moreover, camp staff, though certainly maintaining their authority as jailers, often displayed what internees described as genuine kindness and concern for children's welfare. Edward Creye, who was a child at Crystal City, recalled decades later that the internees were treated nicely, they had good food, and even saw movies in the community hall twice a week. The camp had constructed a swimming pool where internees could swim. There were organized sports, with 32 softball teams divided into 2 leagues with scheduled games and tournament playoffs. The camp offered educational courses in hobby shops for men and home economics, cooking, sewing, flower arrangement, and rug weaving for women. Language courses were available in English, German, Japanese, Spanish, and French. This does not mean Crystal City was comfortable or that detention was anything other than a profound violation. Families lived in cramped quarters. The first winters brought mud everywhere, mud practically up to the knees when it rained, according to camp medical staff. Privacy was minimal. The constant presence of armed guards, censorship of mail, and inability to leave created persistent psychological stress. Many internees resented their imprisonment deeply and experienced it as fundamentally unjust, particularly those who were American citizens detained solely because of their ethnicity or family connections. But the juxtaposition of imprisonment and abundance created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve within the framework of Nazi ideology. If Americans were truly the cruel, collapsing democracy that propaganda claimed, why were they feeding enemy aliens better than Germany fed its own citizens? If American society was genuinely weak and decadent, how had it achieved such systematic abundance that it could afford generosity even toward those it feared? These questions became more acute as the war progressed, and news from Europe grew increasingly dire. By 1944 and 45, even the limited letters that passed through censors made clear that conditions in Germany had deteriorated catastrophically. Women in Crystal City learned of Allied bombing campaigns that had destroyed German cities. They heard rumors, later confirmed, of massive civilian casualties. Some learned that relatives had died, from bombs or from starvation, or from diseases exacerbated by malnutrition. The emotional toll of this knowledge, combined with the daily experience of being well fed while loved ones starved, created a psychological burden that many internees struggled to articulate even decades later. It was a form of survivor's guilt, amplified by the strange circumstance of surviving comfortably among one's supposed enemies while one's own people suffered. For some internees, particularly those who had been active in German-American cultural organizations or who had maintained strong ties to German nationalist ideology, this contradiction produced doubling down on previous beliefs. They interpreted their good treatment as a temporary facade or as evidence of American weakness and inability to properly identify true threats. These internees remained ideologically committed to Germany throughout their detention. But for others, particularly women who bore the daily responsibility of feeding children and managing households, the sustained experience of American abundance gradually eroded certainty. This was not a dramatic conversion or sudden ideological shift. It was a slow wearing away of assumptions through repeated encounters with evidence that contradicted core beliefs. The camp schools became another site of this gradual transformation. Crystal City operated 4 schools to accommodate the diverse internee population. The German school and Japanese school taught in native languages and followed curricula designed to prepare children for potential repatriation. But the camp also operated federal elementary and federal high schools that provided American-style education and were accredited by the Texas State Department of Education. German parents who desired repatriation sent their children to the German school. Those who hoped to remain in or return to the United States often chose the American schools. This choice represented not just educational preference, but a fundamental decision about future identity and belonging. Women, as primary caregivers and household decision-makers in the absence of detained husbands, often made or heavily influenced these choices. The decision was not simple. Sending children to American schools meant accepting that they would be educated in English, according to American values, preparing them for American rather than German futures. It meant acknowledging, at least implicitly, that whatever happened after the war, their children's lives would likely unfold in the United States rather than Germany. For women who had maintained German national identity or who had ideological commitments to Germany, this represented a profound break. But for many mothers, pragmatic concerns outweighed ideological commitment. They observed that American schools offered better resources, that children educated in American schools might have better opportunities, that teaching children English fluency was a practical investment in their survival, regardless of political loyalties. These calculations, made quietly in household conversations, represented the kind of grinding practical adjustments that ideology often cannot withstand. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 1945, as the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, the women in Crystal City faced increasingly urgent questions about their futures. For German nationals who had been deported from Latin American countries, repatriation to Germany seemed likely. For German Americans who were U.S. citizens, the prospect was theoretically different, but the reality of their detention had already demonstrated that citizenship provided less protection than they had believed. The U.S. government had established a prisoner exchange program called Quiet Passage, administered through the State Department's Special War Problems Division. This program traded Axis nationals held in U.S. custody, including their American-born children, for Americans trapped behind enemy lines in Germany and Japan. The program was designed to recover diplomats, businessmen, soldiers, physicians, and missionaries. Hundreds of internees from Crystal City, including American citizens, were exchanged into war-torn Germany and Japan. For the women involved in these exchanges, the journey back to Germany represented a devastating reversal. Many had spent years in Crystal City, where, despite detention, their children had been safe, well-fed, educated. Now they were being sent back to a country that was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, where cities lay in ruins, where food was scarce to the point of starvation, where the Nazi regime was in its final desperate collapse. Ingrid Iserloh's family was among those exchanged. In February 1944, they were transported from Crystal City to New York and then aboard a ship to Europe. The voyage took them to Spain and Portugal first, where Edward Cray, another exchange internee, recalled they were welcomed and treated almost like celebrities. But when they reached Germany, reality set in. Edward described arriving to find that the Allies had already bombed most of Germany to the ground. When a bomb hit the house next door to where his family was staying, they began living in their bunker instead. The contrast between the abundance of Crystal City and the devastation of wartime Germany was overwhelming. Women who had spent months or years eating adequate rations, whose children had drunk milk daily and eaten meat regularly, now faced the grim reality of a collapsing nation where the official bread ration had dropped to levels incompatible with survival. The psychological whiplash of this reversal, moving from American detention with its uncomfortable abundance to German destruction with its desperate scarcity, created trauma that many struggled to process for decades. Meanwhile, those internees who remained in Crystal City through the war's end faced different but equally complex challenges. As Germany surrendered in May 1945 and then Japan in August, the justification for continued detention evaporated. But the camp did not close immediately. Crystal City remained open until February 1948, making it the last internment camp to close, more than 2.5 years after the war ended. During this extended detention period, the psychological dynamics shifted again. Internees were no longer enemy aliens during wartime, but people whose governments had been defeated, whose homelands in many cases lay in ruins, whose futures were profoundly uncertain. The question of food and abundance took on new dimensions. Reports from occupied Germany described severe food shortages, with rations in some areas falling to 1,000 calories per day or less, levels insufficient to sustain life without supplementation from other sources. In Crystal City, internees continued to receive adequate rations. They watched newsreels showing the destruction of German and Japanese cities. They learned details about the Holocaust that had been carried out in Germany's name. They heard accounts of the millions who had starved under German occupation policies in Eastern Europe. The comfortable lie that German scarcity had been imposed by circumstances rather than chosen as a weapon against others became impossible to maintain. For German women in Crystal City during this period, the emotional and ethical reckoning was complex. Many had lost relatives in the war. Some had lost family members to Allied bombing. Others learned that relatives had been complicit in Nazi atrocities or had benefited from the plunder of occupied territories. The simple categories of victim and perpetrator, enemy and ally became impossibly tangled, and through it all, they continued to be well fed. The daily experience of eating adequate food while knowing that millions in Europe were starving, that their own relatives might be among those starving, created a persistent, low-grade anguish that shaped how many internees thought about their experience for the rest of their lives. When Crystal City finally closed in February 1948, and the remaining internees, all of German ethnicity, were sent to Ellis Island for final processing, many faced yet another reversal. Some were allowed to remain in the United States, resuming lives interrupted by detention. Others were deported to Germany, sent back to a country many had left years or decades before, a country now divided into occupation zones and struggling to rebuild from total defeat. Those who remained in America carried complicated relationships with their experience. Some spoke openly about their detention, describing both the injustice of imprisonment and the strange mercy of being fed well during years when much of the world was hungry. Others remained silent for decades, processing their experience as private trauma that did not fit comfortable narratives about wartime suffering. The intersection of imprisonment and abundance, of being simultaneously violated and cared for, created a psychological complexity that resisted simple storytelling. Decades after the war, as scholars began systematically collecting oral histories from former internees, patterns emerged in how German women described their experience. Many emphasized the contradiction at the heart of their detention: the barbed wire and the abundance, the armed guards and the swimming pool, the censored mail and the butter. These juxtapositions appeared repeatedly in testimonies, suggesting they represented something fundamental about how internees understood what had happened to them. Dr. John Heitman, whose parents were interned, spent years researching the camps and interviewing former internees. He documented how his father Alfred had been detained in 1942 as a dangerous pro-Nazi sympathizer, based on weak evidence and statements by informants who likely wanted to save themselves and their families. That the accusations were unsubstantiated was later proven by FBI investigation, including the fact that Alfred Heitman did not own a camera and could never have taken the many photographs attributed to him, but by the time this was established, years of detention had already passed. What emerges from these testimonies and documents is a picture of women caught between worlds. They had been detained by a country that feared their loyalty to an enemy regime, but that country had also fed them, educated their children, and treated them according to international law, even as their ancestral homeland was violating such laws systematically. They had experienced the trauma of imprisonment and family separation, but they had also experienced a level of material security that many of their relatives in Germany could not imagine. This does not mean their detention was justified, or that good treatment excused the violation of their civil liberties. The detention of German Americans and German nationals in the United States, like the far more extensive detention of Japanese Americans, is now widely recognized as unjust and motivated more by racism and wartime hysteria than genuine security needs. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians concluded that these camps represented an unjust curtailment of civil liberties. But within that unjust system, the specific experience of food, of being fed well while loved ones starved, created psychological and moral complexities that transcended simple categories of right and wrong. It raised questions about what nations owe to those they detain, about the relationship between material conditions and ideological conviction, about how abundance and scarcity shape human psychology and political belief. The tears that Margarete Schmidt shed on that first day in Crystal City, holding a bag of groceries she had not known how to hope for, were not just relief or grief or shame. They were the beginning of a transformation that she, like many women in her situation, would spend years trying to understand. The transformation was not from loyalty to betrayal or from German to American identity. It was something more subtle and more profound, a shift in the bedrock assumptions about how the world worked and what nations were capable of. Women who had managed scarcity as a moral discipline, who had internalized the narrative that German sacrifice demonstrated superiority, now faced daily evidence that abundance was not the product of moral weakness, but of systematic organization and resource allocation. Women who had been told that American democracy was collapsing and decadent discovered that it was capable of feeding even those it feared. Women who had accepted that starvation was an inevitable cost of total war learned that it had been a choice, one their nation had made deliberately and imposed on millions. These revelations did not come as dramatic moments of conversion, but as slow accumulations of dissonance that could not be resolved within existing frameworks. A woman who cried over a pound of butter was not necessarily rejecting her German identity or embracing American ideology. She was acknowledging that something she thought she understood about the world had been fundamentally wrong. The broader historical significance of these experiences lies not in individual stories of transformation, but in what they reveal about the relationship between material conditions and ideological commitment. Nazi ideology had relied heavily on narratives of sacrifice, discipline, and moral superiority through scarcity. German civilians were told that their hardships demonstrated strength, that American abundance revealed degeneracy, that victory would come through superior will even in the face of material disadvantage. But these narratives could not withstand sustained contact with a different reality. When German prisoners of war arrived in the United States and encountered abundance far exceeding Nazi propaganda's descriptions, their psychological transformation was documented by camp officials. Medical officers noted that prisoners who arrived as fanatical Nazis gradually questioned everything they had been taught, as the evidence of American abundance became too overwhelming to dismiss as propaganda. The same pattern appeared among German women in civilian internment. The daily experience of adequate food, reliable supply systems, and genuine abundance gradually undermined the ideological structures that had made sense of deprivation. This did not mean internees became uncritical admirers of America or that they forgot the injustice of their detention, but it did mean that certain fundamental assumptions about American weakness and German superiority became impossible to maintain. This psychological transformation had concrete historical consequences. When German prisoners of war and civilian internees returned to Germany after the war, they carried with them experiential knowledge of American abundance that contradicted much of what Germans had been told for 12 years. They had seen American industrial capacity firsthand. They had eaten food produced by American agricultural systems. They had witnessed the casual efficiency with which America organized and administered large operations, including detention camps. These returned prisoners and internees became what historians have called inadvertent ambassadors of democracy. They had not been convinced by propaganda or argument, but by the simple material reality of American abundance. When they spoke to other Germans about their experiences, they provided testimony that no amount of American information campaigns could have achieved. They said, with the authority of personal experience, that America was not weak, not collapsing, not on the verge of defeat. They described, often reluctantly and with complex feelings, a level of abundance and organizational capacity that made Germany's defeat comprehensible rather than incomprehensible. The role of food in this transformation cannot be overstated. Food is not merely sustenance, but symbol, social practice, and psychological anchor. For women, who bore primary responsibility, WWII, continue for household feeding and who experienced scarcity as a daily moral calculus about who would eat and how much, the sudden abundance of food carried meanings that transcended simple nutrition. It represented the collapse of an entire framework for understanding deprivation, sacrifice, and national destiny. Consider what it meant for a German mother who had spent years carefully portioning bread, who had watched her children's ribs become visible through their skin, who had made impossible choices about whether to feed the elderly or the young, to suddenly find herself in a place where such choices were unnecessary. The relief was undoubtedly profound, but so was the disorientation. If adequate food had been available all along, if America could feed even its enemies well, then what had the years of German sacrifice actually meant? This question haunted many internees long after their release. The sacrifice had been real. The hunger had been real. The deaths of family members from malnutrition-related diseases had been real. But the necessity of that sacrifice, the inevitability of that hunger, had been a lie. Germany had chosen to starve others to feed itself, and had still ultimately failed to provide adequate food for its own civilians. America had chosen to feed even its detained enemies according to international standards, and had done so while simultaneously conducting a global war on multiple fronts. The implications of this comparison were devastating for those who had believed in German superiority or Nazi ideology. It suggested that the entire moral framework justifying German sacrifice and aggression had been built on false premises. If American abundance was not evidence of degeneracy but of effective organization and resource management, if feeding enemies well was not weakness but the practice of systematic law and order, then what remained of the ideological claims that had made sense of 12 years of Nazi rule? For women like Margarete Schmidt, who had volunteered for detention to stay with her husband but who carried no particular ideological commitment to Nazism, the question was somewhat simpler but no less profound. She had believed that her family's hunger in Cincinnati, even before detention, was simply the way things were during wartime. Everyone was making sacrifices. Everyone was rationing and managing scarcity. That was what responsible citizens did during total war. But Crystal City revealed that this narrative was incomplete. America was also fighting a total war, also mobilizing its entire economy, also sending millions of men to fight on distant fronts. Yet, American civilians were not starving. American children were drinking milk. American families had access to meat and sugar and coffee. And even detained enemy aliens, people suspected of disloyalty to the American war effort, were fed according to the same standards as American soldiers. This was not just abundance. This was abundance as policy, as systematic choice, as reflection of national capacity and international legal commitment. The contrast with Germany's hunger policies, once understood, could not be unseen. The impact of this recognition extended beyond individual psychology to affect how German women related to their own national identity and to the war's outcome. Historians who have studied German civilians' responses to defeat note a pattern of what they call mourning and melancholy that persisted for years after 1945. Germans mourned their dead, their destroyed cities, their national humiliation, but underlying that mourning was often a more complex psychological process of reckoning with the gap between what they had been told and what had actually been true. For German women who had experienced both wartime Germany and American detention, this reckoning had a particular shape. They had intimate knowledge of both systems. They knew what it felt like to manage German rationing through its various stages of adequacy and then collapse. They knew what it felt like to receive American rations that exceeded their previous standards even during detention. They could compare not through abstract statistics or propaganda, but through the direct sensory experience of hunger and satiation, of scarcity and abundance. This experiential knowledge made certain propaganda claims impossible to maintain. When post-war German politicians or holdout Nazi sympathizers claimed that Germany had been defeated only through overwhelming material superiority, that the German people had fought nobly but been crushed by sheer numbers and resources, women who had experienced American detention could add crucial context. Yes, American material superiority had been overwhelming, but that superiority had been the product of systematic organization, technological innovation, and effective resource management, not merely the accident of geography or the exploitation of others. The food they had eaten in Crystal City, the white bread and butter and fresh meat, had come from an American agricultural system that had increased production while also sending millions of farm workers to war. The abundance had been achieved through mechanization, scientific agriculture, organized distribution networks, and effective administration. It was not magic or theft. It was the result of choices about how to structure an economy and a society. These observations, shared quietly in post-war conversations among returned internees and their families, contributed to the broader psychological and cultural transformation of post-war Germany. The process of reckoning with Nazi crimes and German responsibility was long, painful, and incomplete. But part of that process involved recognizing that the claims of German superiority had been unfounded, that the suffering imposed on Germany's enemies had been both criminal and ultimately counterproductive, that the war had been lost not through betrayal or accident, but through fundamental German weaknesses and miscalculations. German women's testimonies about their experiences in American detention camps became part of this larger reckoning. Their stories complicated simplistic narratives about German victimhood or Allied cruelty. They provided evidence that even in detention, even as suspected enemies, they had been treated according to law and fed according to international standards. This did not excuse their detention or erase its injustice, but it did establish a baseline of treatment that contrasted sharply with how Germany had treated those it detained and occupied. The emotional complexity of these testimonies, the tears over abundance, the guilt at being well fed while relatives starved, the disorienting recognition that enemies had shown more consideration than ideology had predicted, all of this contributed to a historical record that defied simple moral categories. These were not stories of pure victims or pure perpetrators. They were stories of people caught between systems, experiencing the collision of ideology and material reality, struggling to make sense of what abundance and scarcity revealed about power and morality. As the decades passed and Germany rebuilt itself as a democratic nation integrated into Western Europe, the significance of these wartime and detention experiences evolved. The children who had grown up in Crystal City became adults who carried dual heritages and complex identities. Some maintained German cultural practices while embracing American citizenship. Others felt alienated from both cultures, belonging fully to neither. Still others integrated their experiences into broader narratives about the costs of totalitarianism and the value of democratic institutions. What remained consistent across these varied responses was the recognition that food had been more than food. The butter that made Margarete Schmidt weep, the white bread that Maria Berger's son ate until he was sick, the milk that children drank daily, these were not merely calories and nutrients. They were evidence, undeniable and intimate, of the gap between what they had been told and what was actually true. They were proof, delivered daily in paper bags and on dinner plates, that abundance was possible even during total war, that treating enemies well was compatible with fighting effectively, that the moral framework justifying German sacrifice had been built on lies. The historian Jan Jarboe Russell, who wrote extensively about Crystal City after interviewing dozens of former internees, noted something remarkable about their testimonies. Despite the injustice of their detention, despite the separation from loved ones and the violation of civil liberties, many former internees expressed a kind of grudging gratitude for having been spared the worst of the war's devastation. They had been imprisoned, yes, but they had also been safe, fed, educated. Their children had not been bombed or starved. They had experienced the war's trauma, but had been partially insulated from its worst physical consequences. This gratitude coexisted with anger about detention, grief for what had been lost, and resentment about the violation of their rights. The emotions were not sequential but simultaneous, creating a psychological state that was difficult to articulate and even more difficult for others to understand. How do you explain crying over a pound of butter when that butter represented both care and captivity, both abundance and separation from starving loved ones, both relief and shame? The answer is that you cannot explain it simply, because the experience was not simple. It was the collision of multiple contradictory realities. The reality that you were being well treated by people who had imprisoned you. The reality that your captors were showing you more consideration than your own government had shown to millions of others. The reality that abundance existed in the world, even as your loved ones starved. The reality that the ideological framework that had made sense of sacrifice and deprivation had been fundamentally false. These colliding realities produced tears, not as a single discrete emotion, but as the overflow of psychological complexity that exceeded any individual's capacity to process. The tears were an acknowledgement that something fundamental had broken, not just in external circumstances, but in the internal frameworks through which experience was understood and meaning was made. For historians studying the psychology of warfare and ideological commitment, these testimonies from German women in American detention offer valuable insights. They demonstrate how material conditions shape and ultimately constrain ideological belief. They show that while propaganda can be powerful, it cannot indefinitely withstand direct experiential contradiction. They reveal that food, as perhaps the most basic and intimate form of material experience, carries particular psychological and symbolic weight in challenging ideological certainty. The transformation these women experienced was not simple or complete. Many retained strong German cultural identities. Some maintained that their detention had been unjust, which it was, while also acknowledging that their treatment had been humane, which it also was. These positions were not contradictory but reflective of the genuine complexity of their experience. What they contradictory could not retain. What made the daily experience of abundance untenable was the belief that German suffering had been inevitable, or that American abundance was evidence of moral weakness. They learned, through the simple act of being fed well, that the world was different from what they had been told. That learning, achieved not through argument but through butter and bread and coffee, proved more durable and more transformative than any amount of explicit propaganda could have achieved. The tears that German women shed in Crystal City and other American detention camps during World War II were thus not tears of a single emotion or meaning. They were tears of recognition, of relief, of grief, of shame, of disorientation, and of transformation. They marked the moment when bodies that had learned the rhythms of scarcity encountered abundance, and when minds that had organized themselves around certain certainties found those certainties dissolved by something as simple and profound as adequate food. In the broader sweep of World War II history, these individual moments of tears and transformation represent a small footnote. They did not affect military campaigns or diplomatic negotiations. They did not alter the course of battles or the decisions of generals. But in the intimate history of how human beings experience war, how they respond to the collision of ideology and material reality, how they process the recognition that what they believed was false, these moments matter profoundly. They matter because they reveal that beneath the grand narratives of military conflict and political ideology, there exists a human dimension where transformation happens not through dramatic conversion, but through the daily accumulation of evidence that contradicts belief, where the simple act of eating well can accomplish what volumes of counter-propaganda could not, where a pound of butter can shatter certainty more effectively than any argument. The women who wept over American rations in 1942, 43, 44, and 45 were weeping for many things. For their own hunger finally acknowledged and relieved, for loved ones still hungry far away, for the recognition that they had been lied to about fundamental things, for the disorientation of finding kindness in captivity and abundance in detention, for the impossible complexity of being simultaneously violated and cared for, simultaneously imprisoned and fed, simultaneously enemy and human being worthy of decent treatment. These tears were not weakness. They were the only rational response to discovering that the world was profoundly different from what you had been taught, that your suffering had not been inevitable, that your enemies were more complex than propaganda had suggested, and that the moral certainties you had used to make sense of deprivation were built on lies. They were the tears of transformation beginning, slowly and painfully, one meal at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.